All right, field trip for this week. Today is Sunday, the 22nd. I'm at the Red Cliffs campground just outside of Leeds, south of Leeds. And this trail is if you've been here, you probably know it. This is technically people call it the Red Cliffs Trail. It's actually technically the Lower Red Reef Trail. And so this is an area, you can see we got a lot of this Jurassic sandstone, the red sandstone here. We got a nice the creek coming through here, so there's this nice little riparian area with cottonwoods and ashes and other things. I am kind of gonna go a little bit higher up just to stay away from the crowds because it's a pretty popular place, and who knows with this thing, it's probably better to just be safe than sorry. So anyway, we're in we call this kind of like an upper Mojave transitional zone. We've got some things that we've seen before. So we got a lot of sand sage. You see that kind of light green foliage there, those shrubs, that's all sand sage, Artemisia filifolia, that we saw on our field trip to the Hellhole Trail. We've also got our Dixie live oak here, so our Quercus turbinella, which we also saw at Hellhole. Right, so y'all will remember that one it's the oak with the really spiny leaves. What else have we seen already? Well, here's one we saw before, but I didn't talk about it, so I'm gonna go ahead and talk about it right now. This shrub right here, so this is a really abundant shrub in also kind of the upper Mojave, so this high elevation Mojave sort of transition zone into the Great Basin. This shrub is called blackbrush, and so you can see, I don't know if you can get a sense of the size of it. It's a pretty low growing shrub. Blackbrush, the Latin name is Coleogyne ramosissima, and it's in the rose family, but it's actually really atypical for the rose family. So it has a lot of pretty aberrant traits. So when you look at this, let's see here. You can tell the phyllotaxy of the leaves and the branches. Let me find a clearer example of it here. Sorry for how well you can see, but the phyllotaxy is opposite. And that's pretty unusual in the rose family. And then also just notice the leaves. I mean, pretty typical of kind of a desert, drought, stress tolerating shrub. The leaves, they come out in these little clusters. And so that's one leaf there, right? So the leaves are really small and reduced. There we go. The other thing that's really unusual for the rose family, so if you guys remember, I think we talked about this before, the rose family typically has 5 free petals. So they have 5 meris flowers, 5 petals, 5 sepals. Stamens are in multiples of 5. There's usually 10 or more stamens, 10, 15, but in multiples of 5. And then carpels can vary between 1 carpel and 3, 5, or lots and lots of free carpels. So there's a lot of variation in carpels in that family. But anyway, the flowers of this blackbrush, so it's actually not flowering yet. These are the fruits from last year that we're seeing, these kind of brown, woody looking structures. And let me get one here. So the flowers in this one, they are 4 meris instead of 5 meris. I don't know how well you can see, but there's 2 pairs there. And the things that you're looking at there, those are actually the sepals. And that's all the flower has, even when the flower is fresh. It doesn't have petals, it only has sepals. And so when you see them, they'll be blooming in another few weeks. And you'll see these yellow flowers. The yellow that you're seeing is actually not petals. What you're seeing is the inner wall of the sepals, the inside part of the sepals. So 4 meris flowers with sepals only. Very strange for the rose family, right? Let's see what else. Like I said, just a very abundant plant in this transition zone. It's called blackbrush. If you see them kind of from a distance, the foliage on them is pretty dark green. I think that's where the name blackbrush comes from. They just look kind of dark from a distance. So there you go. So something that's fun with these transitional areas is you'll get a mix of, you know, species, or what they sometimes call elements from different floras, right? So here's a plant that we saw this genus on our campus walk. This is a juniper, but this is the more common native juniper in our area, and this is definitely more of a Great Basin element, right? So this is, but we're seeing it here in sort of the upper Mojave, so it kind of makes its way down here. This is Utah juniper, Juniperus utahensis, and like the one we saw before, which was Rocky Mountain juniper, that's the one that's planted on campus. Basically what you're looking at are opposite leaves. Sorry about that. So I was saying, you have in the Cupersaceae, right, or in Juniperus at least, you've got the leaves are very, very small, reduced, right? So reduced leaves that are basically just right up against the stem. They're basically just like little scale structures, and they're in opposite pairs. So they make that kind of a checkerboard pattern on them, right? So that's juniper. And then the cones are fleshy. They can get kind of woody later at maturity, but at this stage they're pretty fleshy and berry-like. And this, you know, the cones, like any conifer, the cones are made up of separate scales. And remember, the scales represent sort of reduced shoot structures. And in junipers, they fuse together. So the seeds are kind of inside this enclosed berry-like structure. Whoops, there it goes. So pretty similar overall. It has the juniper characteristics that we saw before with the Rocky Mountain juniper, but Utah juniper tends to grow a lot lower, so they can get somewhat big, like, I don't know, 25, 30 feet tall or something, but more typically you find them a little lower, like 10, 15 feet tall, like this one here. And they tend to branch a lot more from the base, whereas Rocky Mountain juniper often has more of kind of a central trunk. This one tends to look a little shrubbier, although we still call it a tree. Okay, so that's Utah juniper, Juniperus osteosperma. And osteosperma, the specific epithet, osteo means bony, and sperma means seed, so bony seed. Okay, here's another interesting plant. So this is an ash, and usually ashes are like full trees. There's actually, down in the riparian zone down here, there's a different ash species called velvet ash that I'll try to get down there later to take a look at it. But up here in these kind of more upland sites away from the water, you'll get this this single leaf ash. The Latin name is Fraxinus anomala. So anomala meaning like anomalous or sort of unusual, and the reason that it's called that is because it's pretty different for an ash. Ashes, like I said, they're usually trees, so this one is kind of more shrubby. Here's another one here. So they got this really shrubby branching from the base kind of growth form. And then the other thing that's anomalous about them is that ashes typically have compound leaves. They have pinnately compound leaves, right? So a single leaf is divided into multiple separate leaflets that are arranged pinnately. So in other words, you got a bunch of leaflets kind of coming ladder-like off the side of the central rachis. And in this one, you can see it's got simple leaves. And when we look at it sort of phylogenetically, what that tells us evolutionarily is that these simple leaves are secondarily derived. In other words, they came from an ancestor with compound leaves. So I think that's where the name Fraxinus anomala comes from. And if you look at them, sometimes you can find, even on this species, you'll get leaves that are like really deeply lobed, like almost compound. Let me see if this is, I'm not really seeing any right now, but sometimes you can find these sort of compound-ish leaves. Okay, like other ashes, so the phyllotaxy of this plant is opposite branching. So here's a good one right here that we can see. Right, so the branches are opposite, and basically these grew from buds that were sitting in the axils of leaves that were also opposite on either side of the stem here. So remember, opposite decussate phyllotaxy. it's harder to see in the leaves, kind of like same with our blackbrush, right? The leaves tend to flush out in these little clusters. So phyllotaxy is hard to distinguish when you have that condition, which is pretty common in desert plants. But you can look at the overall branching, right? The pattern of the branches, and that'll tell you about phyllotaxy as well. The other thing so that's ashes in general have opposite phyllotaxy. Ashes are actually in the olive family, the Oleaceae, so where like olives that you would eat, they come from that family as well. In ashes, genus Fraxinus they are dioecious. So do you guys remember what that means? Dioecious is when you have separate, so the flowers are either all male or all female, and they're on separate plants, right? Two houses, dioecious. And let's look at these flowers here. Let's see if we can figure out what type of flowers these are. Take a look. Any guesses? Can you guys tell what structure that is there? So those are stamens, right? So these are staminate flowers. So they are lacking carpels. Okay, so this is a male plant. And what else do you notice about these flowers? Like, they don't really look like super typical flowers, right? So notice how they don't have really any petals. I mean, the petals are not developed and showy. So they're not built to draw in insect pollinators. So that's a hint of how it's pollinated. It's actually wind pollinated, right? So you can kind of think of it as like a zero-sum resource allocation kind of question. Like if you have a certain amount of resources to allocate to your flowers, if you're not pollinated by an insect pollinator, then you should use those resources to just make lots and lots of pollen. If your pollen is just kind of getting blown, sort of just blown randomly around by the wind, right? So that's what we see. It's kind of, you can look at the flower and kind of guess, right? This not as much as some wind pollinated flowers, but these staminate flowers, they just kind of hang in the wind so that it's kind of like the pollen, when it's released, it can just get picked up by the wind, right? And yeah, Fraxinus anomala, single leaf ash, and that's the common shrub in the upper Mojave, and also gets up at Cedar City elevation. You'll see it up there as well. Okay, so here's a little patch of banana yucca, which we saw last week, or the week before, I guess, at the Hellhole Trail. But we didn't really get up close to it because it kind of was up on the hillside. So I just wanted to review this one really quick. So banana yucca grows, it doesn't really have a trunk generally, not a significant trunk. Compared to Utah yucca, which sometimes can. And then the leaves kind of have this like blue-green tinge to them, and they're a little bit thicker and wider than the leaves of Utah yucca or some of the other yuccas like narrow-leaved yucca, dwarf yucca, and things like that. So they're these big substantial yuccas. You'll find them in the Mojave. There's some with last year's flowers there. I rarely see them with fruit, so I don't know if there's something going on with their pollinators, or if the fruits just get, when the ripe fruits get taken by animals pretty quickly. I don't know. I hardly ever find ripe fruits on them. And then here's another new one I wanted to talk about. So this shrub that's kind of growing among the banana yuccas here, this is cliff rose, which is another member of the rose family. And so cliff rose is in the genus Persia. And so if you know bitterbrush, antelope bitterbrush, it's a close relative. Those are both Persias. Cliff rose, I would say, is actually more common than bitterbrush in our area. So the way to distinguish them, the leaves on these things are pretty small, as you can see, and they're alternate phyllotaxy. You can see on this branch here, alternate, right? And again, kind of leaves tend to grow out in little clusters, very common in plants of arid regions. So let me just get one leaf here to kind of show everybody. Let's see if I can get it in focus here. There we go. So the leaves are they're smaller than in bitterbrush. Bitterbrush, the leaves have 3 lobes. In cliff rose, they have 5 to 7 lobes. And they also have these waxy secretions on the margins. Let me kind of zoom this in as much as I can. So you see the white dots all over there. The leaves just kind of secrete this waxy material. So those are pretty good characteristics to recognize that it's cliff rose and not, bitterbrush or something else. Why am I going out of focus here? There we go. And then also the leaves, if you crush them, you're not going to get this in the virtual experience, but if you crush them, they have kind of a funky, almost like a dirty socks kind of smell to them, kind of like valerian. If anyone's ever had like valerian tea, kind of reminds me of that, sort of just a real funky, fetid kind of a smell. We don't have any flowers yet. They'll bloom a little later in the spring, but I see here's a fruit from last year. And whoops, where am I? There we go. Sorry, I'm still figuring out this whole video thing. So there's last year's fruit, and the seeds are already gone out of there. You see it's kind of fuzzy. The seeds themselves get basically the style of the flower when it's in fruit or in seed. The style tends to elongate out quite a bit. These ones are not very elongated, but you can see those kind of styles in there, those dark sort of like squiggly things in the middle. So these ones maybe didn't get pollinated or didn't develop fully. Let me see if I can find one. Yeah, they all kind of look like that on here. But when they're mature, when they get pollinated and the fruit matures, the style kind of elongates in this long feathery structure, which is a dispersal aid, right? It helps that seed or that dry fruit structure to catch the wind and get carried away in the wind. So Mexican cliff rose, Persia stansberryana. Hey everyone, so here's a teachable moment here. So you recognize this plant? Got our simple leaves with opposite phyllotaxy, growing kind of shrub-like, but it's really actually in a group of trees. So this is our single leaf ash, right? So I saw this and I wanted to show everyone. So this is what the fruits from last year look like. So they have these very, these dry, sort of winged fruits, almost kind of like maples, right? They're flat and they kind of develop these wings that helps them disperse in the wind, right? So that's what an ash fruit looks like in general, right? Most ashes have some, or I think all, I would say, have some variation on this kind of a fruit. So if you've got fruits, then that means this must be a female plant, right? So I wanted to show that. And then I was looking around for flowers, and there are actually flowers on here. And I realized, so what I showed you guys before looks a lot like this. So you actually have these, let me zoom in a little bit. You have these very stamen-looking structures. And so I'm actually not sure at what we were looking at before, if that really was a male plant. It could very well have been a female plant with basically what you've got here are sterile stamens, what we call staminodes sometimes. So a lot of plants that make unisexual flowers, they still make some version of the other, if it's a carpellate plant with carpellate flowers, they still make some version of stamens that are non-functional. So we call those staminodes. So let me see if I can zoom in enough to actually see. So you see how there's those staminodes are in pairs, and then there's a little thing sticking out in the middle between them, that little white thing sticking out. So that's actually the stigma and style of the female flower. So these should be just staminodes, like non-functional stamens. And this is a female plant. So that's interesting. I never realized that before in the ashes. So just to emphasize, right, I am still learning things too. So, and that's how we learn, is just by like kind of knowing information about a plant, and then you kind of apply it. Like I know ashes are all dioecious. So then it logically follows, if you see a plant with fruits from last year, it must be a female plant, right? So just kind of interesting. We're all kind of learning all this stuff together, I guess, right? So here's a cactus, obviously, right? We know it's cactus because it is covered in spines, and those spines represent the leaves, and the spines are in these little clusters called areoles, right? And so last week when we were at Hellhole, we saw the old man prickly pear. I talked about that briefly. I think I talked about how the cactus family there's kind of two main subfamilies in there. There's the opuntioids, which is the prickly pears and the choyas. But most of the diversity is in the cactoid subfamily, Cactoideae. And so this is a member of that, the cactoid group, which is basically the difference is they don't grow with jointed stems. Like you don't see these jointed segments one on top of the other the way you would in a prickly pear or a choya. And they don't have the glochids, those tiny little nasty spines that will get stuck in your skin if you try to touch them. They just have the regular old, the larger spines. I mean, you can see variation in the spine length here. Some of them are longer and some of them are shorter, but they don't have those really almost microscopic glochids. So this is a hedgehog cactus. And this one is interesting because for a long time, all these hedgehogs around here, there's a couple different species. There's claret cups, which are the ones that have the red flowers, and there's actually a bunch of hard to distinguish. There's like 3 hard to distinguish species within that group. But this one is the one with kind of pink flowers, and it's sometimes called strawberry hedgehog cactus or Engelmann's hedgehog cactus. Echinocereus engelmannii was traditionally what this was grouped in. But just recently, a couple years ago, a taxonomist up in northern Utah published a study that established that there's actually within what's traditionally called Engelmann's hedgehog or strawberry hedgehog, there's actually another subtly different species, and that's mostly seems to be what we have around here. So he named it Echinocereus relictus, and the main difference is identified based on ploidy variation within the plant. So Echinocereus relictus is diploid, whereas Echinocereus engelmannii is, I think, tetraploid. I'm not totally sure. So I think most of the ones that we have around the St. George area are this relictus, so this kind of newly described species of hedgehog cactus. And I think the common name, I think, is just called relictual hedgehog cactus, which is kind of weird. But so there's that one, and so you'll often see like multiple stems kind of growing from one base here in this one, and when it blooms, it has these beautiful kind of purpley pink colored petals. So I was actually climbing up this cliff to kind of go across this little ridge here just now, and I saw something across from where I was that was worthwhile coming back down for. So this is, I'm actually going to switch my camera orientation. All right. So this, we've been talking a lot about shrubs and woody plants and not many things in flower. So we finally got a flower, so that's fun. This plant is in the mustard family. This is western wallflower. Latin name is Erysimum capitatum. And it's a pretty widespread plant of the western U.S., herbaceous, as you can see, right? When we talk about herbs, we just mean plants that don't really have significant amount of woody tissues, woody growth to them, right? So it is in the mustard family, Brassicaceae, and I can't remember if I told you guys how families, I think I mentioned how families can have a couple of acceptable names. So plant families nowadays are all supposed to end with this ACE ending, A-C-E-A-E, right? That Latin ending. But there's a few plants that had these traditional names that are kind of have been grandfathered in, and Brassicaceae, the mustard family, is one of them. The traditional name for it is crucifery, which means cross-bearing, right? Crucifery, cross-bearing. And when you look at the flowers, so the Brassicaceae flowers, the petals typically kind of make an X in one plane. So that's where that name comes from. And that's a handy way to sort of recognize them and remember. So basically the petals, what's going on here, there's 4 free petals. It's a rosid. The there's 4 free petals. So you've got your sepals there kind of forming a little tube. The sepals aren't actually fused or anything, but they just kind of stick together. So the petals come up through that tube and then they bend 90 degrees outward. So that's what we call a clawed petal, when they kind of have that kind of a 90-degree bend to them. So that's typical in the mustard family. And then the other really key characteristic, let me zoom in as much as I can here so we can try to see it, is the number of stamens. So if you see 4 free petals kind of in that cross shape, and then if you see in there, so usually the number of stamens is either equal to or a multiple of the number of petals, or there's just lots and lots and lots of stamens. In the Brassicaceae, what you see is 6 stamens, and 4 of them are long and 2 of them are short. So you see how the 4 kind of in the middle, you can see the anthers there, and then to either side, there's 2 shorter stamens there. Okay, so 6 stamens in a 4 plus 2, 4 long, 2 short arrangement, and 4 free petals. I mean, that's Brassicaceae. There's really nothing else it could be. And there's, of course, there's a Latin name for that stamen arrangement. It's called didynamus, D-I-D-Y-N-A-M-O-U-S. But just remember the 4 plus 2. Okay. Other things about Brassicaceae is they tend to be herbaceous. There are some shrubbier ones, but they tend to be herbaceous. And what you tend to see in this group is when they flower, they'll kind of flower along this main stalk, and your more mature flowers will be down toward the base, and then your immature flowers in, here we have flowers in bud still at the top. And so these will kind of mature as they go up, and this stem will keep extending up, and the flowers will mature as they go. And so if it's been flowering for a while, you'll have on the same plant, oftentimes you'll have immature flower buds at the top, you'll have mature flowers a little further down, and then even further down from that, oftentimes you'll see flowers maturing into fruit, so flowers that have been pollinated, and the petals will be falling off, and the fruit, so the carpel in the middle, will be elongating and becoming mature, and oftentimes all on one single plant. So this is western wallflower. It's kind of this bigger herb with these large, not super large, but relatively for the family, these large yellow petaled flowers, and it's decently common. There's quite a few Brassicaceae with yellow flowers, but this one just kind of has a distinctive look to it. The Phyllotaxis alternate, as you can see. The leaves are simple, and you have kind of toothy margins on there, very coarsely toothed. And then you can see the little trichomes on there, the little hairs that give this kind of rough appearance on the surface of the leaf. So I've been seeing this shrub around quite a bit, and I wanted to talk about this one. So at first glance, it might look quite a bit like blackbrush or something like that. But really that's just convergence, right? That's just sort of how you adapt to this desert life as a particular type of shrub. When we get up a little bit closer, we can see some key differences with blackbrush, right? So if you look at the Phyllotaxis, let me just get a branch in here where we can see. So if you look at the Phyllotaxis, where's my hand? There it is. The Phyllotaxis is alternate, right? So again, even though the leaves are sort of flushing out in little clusters, when we look at the overall branching pattern, that is alternate Phyllotaxis, right? I hope that's coming through there, that you can see that. And then the other thing is, remember with the blackbrush, how the fruits, those dried woody fruits, were clustered kind of down in the shrub close to the leaves. And here we've got, this is last year's reproductive output, last year's fruits. And see how they have this sort of structure where they're all coming out from one point. So remember we saw that with that Apiaceae, the umbellifery plant, that Lomatium or Cymopterus, when we were at Hellhole. So, but this is actually not in that family. So this is a buckwheat. So in the genus Eriogonum, it's actually more closely related to that Rumex, that dock that we saw at Hellhole. It's in the same family, the Polygonaceae, the buckwheat or knotweed family. And these umbels are actually not true umbels. They're actually kind of what you call like a quasi-umbel. It's actually a bunch of just flower branches that are kind of squeezed all together, so it looks like they're coming out from one point. The other way to kind of recognize when you get used to seeing them is they're not very symmetrical. They're kind of asymmetrical in a weird way in the Eriogonums. They'll often have this sort of quasi-umbellate inflorescence, but one of the branches will have more flowers on it, and they won't be perfectly sort of arranged exactly around that center point. Some of them might be shorter, like see how this, oops, and this one, see how this inflorescence branch is shorter. So they're like umbels, but they just look kind of a little bit off somehow, is how I recognize them. I don't know, so this is an Eriogonum, which is a buckwheat. I'm not sure of the species, I'll have to check that later. But I've been seeing a bunch of it around here. And then the other, it might be cornbow, so I'm not totally sure, I'll have to check it out. But the other thing to note about Eriogonum, so that's one of our really diverse groups around here. So Utah seems to be kind of a center of diversity for the kind of big three that I talk about are Eriogonum penstemon, which we saw at Hellhole. Remember the penstemon palmeri? And then what's the third one? Eriogonum penstemon. Oh yeah, and milk vetches, astragalus. So this is a big, diverse group. They're not usually super abundant in any one location, but there's just lots and lots of species, and they're really interesting because you can see how shrubby this one is, and then some Eriogonums will be really herbaceous. They can grow in kind of a cushion form where they're just like really low growing close to the ground, almost kind of forming a mat on the ground. So they can be annual, they can be perennial, they do all kinds of stuff. So I appreciate that about them for sure, that they're sort of flexible and quite variable. All right, so that's Eriogonum, and I'll try to figure out the species for you later. There's a lot of them, so it can be tricky. So this shrub is another, what I would say, Great Basin element. And so it's just kind of making its way down here. There's not a ton of it here at Red Cliffs. This is actually in the spinach family, Chenopodiaceae. And this is in the genus Atriplex, which is actually really well represented in the Great Basin. So these are shrubs. Atriplex are shrubs that are pretty salt tolerant. That's kind of their claim to fame. And this is four-winged saltbush, right? And actually among Atriplex are called saltbushes in generally. And among the genus, it's actually one of the less sort of hardcore salt tolerant things. So if you go in the Great Basin, like these salt pan valleys where, right, so remember the Great Basin is an area, actually I'm not sure if we talked about this yet, the Great Basin is an area where there's no outlets, of rivers or streams, there's no outlets to the ocean, and so any water that enters, basically the only way it leaves is by evaporation. So it tends to leave behind a lot of mineral deposits as salts in the soil, and so you'll find these salt pan valleys in the Great Basin where nothing grows, and then on the margins of them where you start to get vegetation, it'll be Atriplex. Those are the things that can tolerate that kind of an environment. So this one is four-winged saltbush, Atriplex convertifolia, and let's see if you can see it on here. So here's a fruit from, again, dried fruit from last year. Let me let's see if I can get it in a little better focus here. I don't know how well you can see. That's maybe not it. Let me find a better one here. So basically the fruit is a dry achene fruit, right? And achene is just a dry fruit that does not split open to release the seeds. And you can see how there's four wings. So that's where the common name comes from, four-winged saltbush. Atriplex convertifolia, and convertifolia means that the leaves are all squished together. Here's another fruit. You can kind of see those four wings there. So again, Atriplex more of kind of a Great Basin thing, but it'll make its way down into the Mojave, and you'll kind of find it here or there. And I think I said, yeah, Chenopodiaceae is the spinach family, or also known as the goosefoot family. It's in the Caryophyllales order. So remember, Caryophyllales, one of the things we mentioned about them is that they're kind of known for being stress tolerators, like the cacti or the spinach family. Okay, I'm down in the riparian area. You can see the little stream here. And this tree is one that I referred to earlier and wanted to talk about. So this is a close relative of the single leaf ash. This is velvet ash, which is Fraxinus velutina. Velutina meaning kind of like velvety texture. And we can see, so it's got, it's more of a tree than the single leaf ash, right? You've got kind of your main trunks here, and it likes these riparian wetter areas around here, native to the Southwest. We have some non-native ashes planted on campus, like green ash, but we do have these native ones here. Here we've got the flower clusters just starting to emerge. Let me see if I can get it into focus here. Still not focusing. Let's see. It's kind of dark here. I don't know how well you can see those. Sorry. Here we go. That looks a little better. So here we've got these flower clusters, and they look staminate to me. Those look like anthers, but now I'm less confident about that determination. But like the other ash, this is a dioecious plant. Those do look pretty staminate. Maybe I'll try to find some that are a little more mature. And then it's kind of cute. You got like the little leaves just popping up through the top here, so you can see those leaves just starting to emerge. Here's some more mature leaves. And if we kind of look at these, so here's one leaf, and so you can see it is pinnately compound. So each one of those is a leaflet on that leaf, just starting to come out. So the flowers emerge before the leaves do in this one. So that's our velvet ash. Ashes in general are threatened by an insect called the ash borer, which is, I think it's a beetle, if I remember correctly. It's either a beetle or a true bug, but I believe it's a beetle. And like a lot of these beetles, it basically digs around under the bark. It lays its eggs under the bark, and then the larvae feed underneath the bark and basically girdle the plant. They cut off the phloem. And it's devastating ashes in the eastern U.S. and making its way here. So as far as I'm aware, currently it's not in Utah yet, but it's kind of on the way. So that's not good. So we've also got our cottonwoods here. They're very common in riparian areas, riparian zones in our area as well. I think I'm going to save that one for later and talk about this little shrub here kind of growing sort of in the understory. So this is a baccharis, and this is another sort of riparian shrub in our area. It's in the sunflower family. It's a composite. So the leaves look they're actually pretty willow-like, kind of narrow, simple leaves, alternate phyllotaxy. There's a few baccharis around here. So they have these kind of dark green leaves, this kind of foliage. And then the flowers, so what we're seeing here, that's the fruits from last year. Remember when we looked at that senecio in lab? So they make this, they have these heads, right? So each one of those is actually an inflorescence head with lots of little tiny flowers all crowded together. And commonly in the Asteraceae and the composites family, the sepals have actually been converted into these kind of bristle-like structures. It's called a pappus. And those aid with dispersal. So those help those fruits get caught by the wind, and the fruit is an achene. So let's see if we can get in a little closer and zoom in as much as I can. So you see how they basically look like little dandelion seeds, right? And they're actually not seeds, they're fruit. So they have the carpal wall around them. So they're a type of achene, and it's an inferior ovary. So the sepals and petals are situated on top of the ovary, and then the petals dry up and fall away. the sepals are those bristly pappus things at the top, and that's how they disperse. So this is Baccharis sergilioides. I believe this is called desert Baccharis, Baccharis. I'm assuming with the video editing software that I'm going to be able to put these names like on the screen for you. And another interesting thing about Baccharis, they are also dioecious, so separate male and female plants. So this is apparently a female plant because we see the mature fruits from last year on it. Just to show how different and weird eriogonums can be, right? So we saw that shrubby eriogonum. This is another eriogonum. This is Eriogonum inflatum, desert trumpet. And so you can see, so these are the inflorescences. I don't know how well it's going to show up on the video, but they also have these kind of quasi-umbellate inflorescences, but they're way stretched out, right? And then right below this point where the main branches of the inflorescence meet, the stem is inflated and hollow. That's where the name Eriogonum inflatum comes from. And I don't know why they do that, if that's to help with dispersal or what it is. You'll often see insect boreholes in them, like right here, but not always. So it's not caused by the insect. It's not a gall. They always do this. Down at the base of the plant, you've got these herbaceous leaves. So just really different from that other shrubby eriogonum we saw, and that's just kind of a taste of how different they can be. And this is a really common one in the Mojave as well, this Eriogonum inflatum. There's a bunch of them here on this hillside. All right, I thought I was done showing you guys plants, but there's one more really cool one I wanted to talk about. Another flower here, this thing I stumbled across. So this is in the Buttercup family, Ranunculaceae. This plant is Anemone multifida, I believe. I'm going to double check the ID on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So Ranunculaceae, you can recognize the the leaves. So here's a leaf, right? The leaves are usually compound and or sort of highly dissected, like deeply lobed like that, and in three parts. So they call them tripartite leaves, right? So you can see this whole thing is a leaf. So there's three leaflets, and each of the leaflets is kind of dissected into sort of three main parts to it. Really approaching kind of like a doubly compound leaf there. So these kind of like highly divided and or compound leaves in sort of threes is a very Ranunculaceae characteristic. The other way to know them is oftentimes they lack sepals, so they only have one sort of petaloid whorl. And I believe developmentally these are petals, true petals. Or in some cases they might actually be sepal. But anyway, there's one whorl. And then if you look inside the flower, there's usually lots of stamens. So see all those stamens in there. And also notice how the petals or petaloid things, whatever they are, that they're not sort of a defined number. So I count here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This one here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? So the numbers vary. It's not like a set number the way it is like in Rosaceae, or a given species will generally just have 5 petals unless it's some kind of weird mutant. And then the last thing in this family is, I don't know how well you can see the carpels there, but there are lots and lots of carpels, right? Lots of separate carpels. So they're apocarpous. So the carpels are not fused together, and there's tons of them, just all that little kind of mound in the middle. Every one of those little things on there is a separate carpel, which some Rosaceae also have, like raspberries and things like that, right? When you look at the flower, there's lots of separate carpels, strawberries, blackberries. But the way to tell the difference is that among the other features we talked about already, the Ranunculaceae, the Buttercup family, they don't have a hypanthium ever, versus Rosaceae, which almost always have a hypanthium. You see how everything just comes right down to the base. There isn't that little like floral cup hypanthium structure around the carpels. Okay, so this is Anemone multifida, and I'm not totally sure of a common name, but I'll look into it.